there is no doubt that the war in Gaza has impacted, every single element that you can think of, but probably and arguably none more than the media and the media narrative. And this has been a place where there has been a struggle of sorts for the truth, for a proper analysis of what's going on. And we've seen something which I consider quite concerning from the viewpoint of someone whom for years, decades probably even, has been involved in training on media and media narratives and how to create a narrative and how to capture a news report and how to analyze and all these things pertaining to the media. And I have to say that something like 25 years ago, I wouldn't flinch when mentioning that Britain's media, particularly the BBC, was, sort of a symbol that represented something akin to professionalism, to integrity, to seeking the truth, to verifying news before broadcasting them. But one of the things that has become absolutely clear, I mean, it's been going downhill for a while, but particularly after the 7th of October, the overall media performance has been nothing if not shambolic. Yeah. And it's been utterly unprofessional. It's been sometimes, on the verge of farcical even. Yeah. And this surely, I mean, it represents probably two things. Firstly, the state of global media, not only British media, but global media. But also, secondly, that the media war, if I'm allowed to use that expression, has been won by the Palestinians. Would I be wrong in assuming this?
No, you're not wrong at all. I mean, I think there's a lot of issues here. I mean, I think one of them is just the general decay of institutions in the West, generally speaking. Britain especially, a lot of institutions are generally crumbling, and you can't exclude the BBC from that. But I think, the BBC especially, but also the entire edifice of Western media, has always had a very strong propaganda element to it. Like, it's always had a very strong support for its own government, right? It's always been very partisan in that way, while trying to appear as if it was fair and balanced and neutral and have this this kind of veneer of professionalism. But you're right. There is definitely a sense that this process, a process of deprofessionalization almost within Western media, I would say, has really accelerated a lot in recent years, and especially since 7th of October last year, because you can see things like, I've talked to family members who just, within my own family, who, when I'm putting on Al Jazeera, for example, the contrast between Al Jazeera's coverage of Gaza, the reality that's portrayed on Al Jazeera, or because that's easier to watch because it's on Freeview, and what's on the BBC is it's a completely different world. The overall coverage on the BBC, even on Channel 4 News and ITV news bulletins, it's a very different picture that they're painting of what's happening in Gaza. They don't show the reality so much. Even when there's exceptions, like a few weeks ago there was this bulletin on ITV, which was quite good, and it showed, it was good in terms of the journalism that was doing, and it showed Palestinian civilians who were waving white flags and still being shot deliberately by the Israelis. Yeah. And so that was quite good journalism, but even that was sort of framed as if it was some sort of uniquely
abnormal.
Abnormal and
it was the exception to the rule.
Exactly.
What you say is interesting, because I remember a time when the BBC, specifically the BBC, because of the nature of how the BBC was founded, how it was funded and continues to be funded. So it's sort of unique amongst, its peers of media platforms around the world. But I remember when a news report is a news report, you say this has happened and it's happened at this time in this place. And these are the fatalities or casualties. These were the parties that were involved. This is what the authorities have said. And then you leave it to the analysts or to the people who you brought as guests to portray their take from their respective political or ideological point of views. But now you have the actual framing of the news itself in accordance with a specific political and ideological. So it's as though the BBC has become party to the news rather than a mere portrayer or purveyor of the news. And that is troubling.
Yeah, I think it is used to push this ideological line, really, which in the case of Israel is that Israel is basically the Israeli propaganda narrative, and the Western narrative about, that the image they try and portray essentially is that, well, for example, with the US, that the American president, well, he's not happy with the war that's happening in Gaza, and he is trying to sort of rein back the Israelis a bit, and there's not much he can do about it. And just missing out the most obvious elephant in the room, which is that, nearly $4 billion in military aid that goes to Israel every year from the United States, in terms of support from Britain and the rest of Europe, absolute, as well as military assistance, as well as arms sales, absolute political and military support, political and diplomatic support, and all kinds of different support for Israel in all kinds of ways that goes to Israel from Britain, from British government, from the British opposition. Those pressure points, those potential leverage points, are completely missed out. They're generally not portrayed, and just the obvious question is rarely asked about. Well, okay, if you really wanted to stop what's happening in Gaza, you could actually do something about it. You could actually stop weapons going, for example, instead of this sort of framing and narrative of, oh, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, which is the Israeli propaganda narrative, because Israel, the fact is that Israel isn't defending itself. Israel's never been defending itself. And really, in a way, the concept of Israeli self-defense doesn't exist. Like, it's a complete contradiction in terms, because the whole existence of Israel is predicated on the destruction of the Palestinians and the literal wiping of Palestine off the map, and the expulsion of the Palestinians. We all know that the expulsion of the Palestinians began with the foundation of Israel, or even before then. Really, it has its roots before then, going back really 135 years. So there's limits to the historical context that you can get into within a short news bulletin, but the basic facts of the fact that, for example, the 2.3 million people in Gaza, 80% of them are refugees who were expelled, and their descendants since 1948. So that these basic facts are often left out. And you're right, like there was a sense more in the past where there was a sense of kind of professionalism in the past in Western media that has really gone now in a lot of ways. I mean, you see, for example, only I forget now when exactly it was. Was it November or December when John Pilger passed away?
Yes.
The really a brilliant journalist with an absolutely brilliant career who exposed the truth in a lot of ways, and but in his lifetime, he had access to mainstream media with what would be considered to be dissenting narratives in a lot of ways, but he still was able to get some really brilliant films and documentaries onto ITV. Later on, they sort of pushed it more towards the late night slots and things like that, but he was able to get access to the mainstream in a way that, for want of a better phrase, dissenting journalists wouldn't be able to now. And by the end of his career, he was marginalized and he wasn't able to access in the same way that he was in the past.
Do you see people seeing through that? Do you see more and more people losing trust and confidence in the likes of the BBC as well as CNN and the rest of what we term and what we call mainstream media? I'm not entirely sure whether that in the world of TikTok and social media and the such, and people getting their news feed from alternative media, news media, why it is that we still call it mainstream media. But still, do you see more and more people seeing through the lies, the fabrications, the analysis that is bipartisan?
Yeah.
I mean, do you see that?
Yeah, I think so, because there is a sense in which, I do think the internet plays a role in this. I mean, look, the internet's not a panacea because obviously anyone can put anything on the internet to a large degree. There is increasing restrictions and censorship on the internet, but to a large degree, there is good things and bad things on the internet, right? So there's correct information, there's raw information, which is just information that's out there without any particular context. And there's also disinformation on there. So you have to kind of sift through everything. So it's not a panacea, but there is a sense in which that a lot of the raw facts of what is happening in Gaza, what is happening to the Palestinians, is being put out there online, and people, especially younger people, are seeing it on their social media feeds, even if it's not, in the full context and there's not a full journalistic explanation necessarily. They're seeing things just there as raw data, which are not then portrayed within the corporate media, within the so-called mainstream media. And I think you're right. Like, it is a question of, should we really call it mainstream anymore when trust in it has been eroding for many, many years? And there is a good reason for that. Because the example of Gaza is a good one because of this. Because people are seeing these horrible videos coming out of Gaza, and then you turn to the BBC. If people turn to the BBC, ITV, or even Channel 4 News, Sky, and so forth, and they're not seeing these things, then it's just another. It's going to be a question of, well, why aren't they showing these things? Or even from the other side, they're not showing even the Israeli videos that are coming out of Gaza. It was only this month that the New York Times, for example, did a story about all these horrendous Israeli videos that are coming out, that Israeli soldiers have been posting on TikTok of boasting of how all the war crimes they're doing, they're looting, shooting people dead, shooting children dead, demolishing buildings, controlled demolitions of civilian buildings, civilian infrastructure, normal people's homes, rifling through women's underwear drawers, just war crimes on camera that they're filming themselves and then boasting about it and posting to TikTok or wherever they're posting it to, these Israeli soldiers. And this is then sort of being ignored by a lot of the mainstream media. And, as I said, we've seen the New York Times has only just done something about this. And I even though this has been happening all along, I just saw a news story today about Israeli soldiers. It was in Israeli media, actually, an Israeli website, talking to Israeli soldiers who said that looting, for example, has become completely commonplace, completely normalized, and they're just stealing from Palestinians' homes. There was also an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, that I think it was last week. They published a feature story with lavish photos, and it was about cooking. It was a cooking feature about how Israeli soldiers were having to improvise and cook with food and ingredients that they found in Palestinians' homes. So this was portrayed not as a crime; it was just portrayed as, oh well, this is just something they have to do because they have to eat.
Daytime TV.
Yeah, it was that sort of level. It was really, really, really disgusting stuff. And this is the kind of thing that's normalized in Israeli media. And so, people are, and that story in particular wasn't published in English, even though Haaretz does translate most of its articles into English. That one was only in Hebrew. But people then, I don't know if they used machine translation or this person understood Hebrew. A lot of Palestinians understand Hebrew as well. They posted on Twitter, on X, as it's now called, and just saying, like, look, this is the story here. This is what the Israeli media is normalizing. So we're seeing this stuff on our social media feeds that's not being reflected in the so-called mainstream media. And so that is another thing that leads to an erosion of trust with these corporate media organizations, because, if I mean, obviously I'm a journalist, but if I as a normal person can see this, as just a member of the public, can see this stuff on my social media feeds, well then, it doesn't take much of a leap to think, well, what's stopping a journalist collecting this stuff and reporting on it, and why aren't they reporting?
I mean, there used to be times when journalists, real, especially young journalists, straight out of, I don't know, either media college or journalism school or the such, where, the story was something that they pursued with such vigor, sometimes to the annoyance of everyone else. But it seems today that ready-made stories, which are out there, which are being produced by young Gazans whose homes have been totally demolished and their families obliterated, and they're giving them the news, they're showing them around, they're telling the stories and the such, and those are such compelling stories. We talk about, when I was much, much younger, there was something called the human dimension, always go, the human dimension. There is nothing more human, than what's happening today. Yet there seems to be either a lack of will, or there seems to be some designed or orchestrated attempt to quell those stories and to basically prevent them from going out there. Now, you know this, but the importance of the media that is available to everyone is that it is one of the main pillars of why democracy works, or is supposed to work. Essentially, this goes back to since Aristotle. The question about democracy is that how can you equate between a vote for someone who's a peasant who doesn't know how to read or write and doesn't know much about beyond, his herd of sheep or cows or the such, and the vote of someone who's been in politics, who's been in government for years, probably even decades. How do those two equate? It doesn't make sense. However, one of the means by which those become almost equal is that there is a pool of knowledge, there is a pool of information that everyone has and upon which can make a decision.
Yeah.
And that is essentially the media. Yeah. So if you pollute that pool of knowledge in the way that we're seeing today, surely, the risk is not only on the integrity of the media or the BBC or this or that. The risk is on democracy itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Like, people can only make decisions, informed decisions, if they are informed, if they are, if they actually, people can only make the decisions based on the information that they have and don't have, right? So if they're not, and a lot of this is to do with the mission, the things that aren't being reported in the media. So if people don't know about what's happening in Gaza, for example, if people are not informed of, the fact that there is now 30,000 Palestinians who have been killed and almost 30,000 and thousands more dead bodies under the rubble, if people don't know about that, then, it makes it harder for them to potentially hold their politicians to account, for example, because why would they? Because they don't know about it. And so people do fall back on social media for that reason, and we do hear a lot. There is a lot of talk these days about younger people getting their news from social media, and I don't think that's. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but it's not necessarily a good thing either, because, as I mentioned earlier, social media can tend to be just sort of raw information, which isn't necessarily, and that works both ways, because it allows governments, corporations, lobbies to just put out their own information, their misinformation, and so I mean, it is the whole thing is an erosion of democracy. It's the media in this country, especially in a lot of ways, it's structurally tends towards supporting the government, supporting the state, supporting the government of the day. And that means that it's so much easier for journalists within these institutions, within the BBC, to go with the flow, because it's harder to go out and find a story which will then get you into trouble, for example, with your editor, or will get you into trouble with government spin doctors, or will get you into trouble, in this case, in the case of Gaza, will get you into trouble with the ProIsrael Lobby, which has this fairly effective weapon of weaponized anti-Semitism, where they try and misportray any criticism of Israel they possibly can as quote-unquote anti-Semitic, where they say, well, you just hate Jews, you don't really care about the Palestinians, you just hate Jews, you're anti-Semitic. And then that is a further erosion of democracy, and it causes bigger problems. And in the long run, and we were discussing this earlier on the way to the studio, that actually causes anti-Semitism, because it means that the real discussion about what is really happening of this process of the structural limitations on Western media, the structural tendency towards supporting government narratives, and the process of how the Israel lobby works, those discussions can't happen openly. Those discussions are marginalized, and those discussions, if people don't have access to engage in those kind of discussions of what is actually happening, some people will fall back on anti-Semitism, on actual anti-Semitism. So it is a process whereby the pro-Israel lobby is actually causing anti-Semitism.
What's your take on something that is also, I don't know whether it's something that has happened recently, but it's quite marked that many commentators, especially the pro-Palestinian commentators, who come on prominent shows, including, for instance, and I'm going to give this as an example, the Piers Morgan show, who then become a target for security forces, who become then a target for, to being sacked from their jobs, demonized in the press as a result of them being invited on a show where they oblige, they're asked questions, they respond regardless of, whether we agree or disagree with them, but they answer, I presume, in as truthfully as they could fathom, but then suffer so immensely as to lose their jobs, lose their credibility, their reputation tarred and tarnished, their families being, hounded, their children at school, all these things. This is surely a depiction of something that we've read by Orwell at some stage of time. This is a state which brings about much, much concern.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of McCarthyism in public life, isn't it? I mean, it's, Israel is viewed as this litmus test, right? That okay, you can criticize Israel within a narrow framework, but you can't. It has to be done within this what is viewed as an acceptable way, right? You can only question the Israeli government, or you can question Netanyahu. You can't. You're not allowed to really bring up the basic facts of how Israel was created, i.e., what
the being of Israel.
Yeah, the very existence of Israel, and the fact that it is predicated on the destruction of Palestine and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, and that is a process that is continuing now. Like if you try and say that on these kind of shows, like I've seen it happen, for example, on Talk TV when pro-Palestinian commentators are brought on those programs, and they try and talk about the Nakba and talk about the expulsion of the Palestinians. I saw Julia Hartley-Brewer, I think her name is, saying to one of her pro-Palestinian guests, oh, it was Mustafa Barghouti, the Palestinian.
Who is a Palestinian? He's not only pro-Palestinian, he is a Palestinian.
A Palestinian politician. He mentioned the Nakba, alluded to the Nakba, and she got very offended and sort of said, well, you Palestinians always bringing up history, and we can't talk about all the whole history. But those kinds of, that is missing the point, isn't it? Because this isn't like some abstract history that is in a history book that's in the past and we have to move on from. The Nakba wasn't just a singular incident in history that began in 1947-48. It was a process that started then and has never stopped.
Has never stopped.
It's never stopped.
Until this very day.
It is the same. I mean, there's a real reason why UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees, recognizes not just the Palestinians who were expelled in 47, 48, 49 as refugees, but their descendants. There's a concrete reason for that, which is that their descendants were born in refugee camps. They wouldn't have been born in refugee camps if their parents and their grandparents had not been expelled. And crucially, this is the crucial point, it's not just the fact they were expelled, they've been prevented from returning ever since. In every other war, yes, there is refugees, people, it can happen, there is expulsions, but people are allowed to return after wars. It does happen. And it has happened in other cases. And people have that, whether they choose to return or not is another question. But the refugees who are expelled in the course of a war or who flee in the course of a war have an inherent and irrevocable right to return if they choose to do so. And the vast majority of Palestinians would choose to do that, but they are being prevented and have always been prevented by Israel from doing that. With the backing, especially since the late 1960s, early 70s, by the United States, with the backing of Europe and the backing of Britain and so on and so forth. And they are prevented from returning purely and simply because they are not Jewish. Yeah. That is the, people have termed it a white supremacist ideology of Zionism, or a Jewish supremacist ideology. However you think of it, it is a racial ideology whereby Jews are conceived of as a racial people, as a racial group, as a superior kind of Western, right? Even though that is a historical, but they are conceived of as a Western racial group, and indeed the majority of the early Zionist settlers were from Europe, were settler colonists from Europe. So that is true, and And because the Palestinians are not Jewish, because they are this, they are, majority of them are Muslims, but also Christians, because they are perceived to be, by Zionism, to be inferior to European Jews and to Jews from around the world, they are prevented from returning because they want to have a so-called Jewish state. And so the Nakba is not this singular event in history. It's a process that really began then and is continuing to this day. And we see it graphically. We see, if these people like Julia Hartley-Brewer don't want to talk about history, well, let's talk about the 6th of October, 2023.
Yeah.
By the 6th of October 2023, there had been almost 250 Palestinians killed in the West Bank by Israel during the so-called ceasefire.
Yeah.
That's the idea of the ceasefire. That is the kind of normal kind of peace, or what Israel considers to be quiet, or relative calm, as the BBC would term it. And there's this normalization of the killing, murder, torture, and abuse, sexual assault by Israeli prison staff of Palestinians, and that this is an ongoing normal state of affairs that is ignored by the Western media. And there's no way that Palestinians have never accepted that, and they never will accept that. And so that is why they resist, why they fight back, and why, let's go back, just a few years prior to that, 2018, there was an event called the Great March of Return, where Palestinian refugees in Gaza were, they carried out a non-violent campaign to try and return to their homes. As I said, 80% of them are refugees, try and return to their homes in historic Palestine, in what the Israelis consider to be Israel. And so they marched peacefully towards the barrier fence between Gaza and the 1948 territories. And they were shot dead. They were murdered by Israeli snipers. That was the response. And there was very little condemnation of this among Western politicians.
Yeah, amongst those killed were nurses and medical staff that were attending to the wounded.
Yeah, children, teenagers.
Yeah,
and this is that was an unarmed. It was a form of resistance. I'm reluctant to call it peaceful, because it was peaceful from the Palestinian side, but the result was a massacre by the Israelis. So you can't say it was peaceful in that sense. This is what people should bear in mind when they say that the Palestinians should put down their weapons and that they should surrender to Israel and things like that. So,
let's focus on the positives that have emerged. And amongst the positive that we've just mentioned is that people are switching off from the BBC.
Yeah.
They are turning away from the so-called mainstream media. And they are heading towards either social media platforms or private podcasts or whatever it is, in order to get their feed of news and information and the such. But with that, there is, and this is something that I've been observing now since the start of this war in early October, is that countless young people are now turning to research for their own, to ask questions that are deemed off the table, questions about the very being of Israel, questions about Zionism, questions about issues of resistance, for instance. I mean, that concept, which is absolutely, it's an absolute no-no in any kind of discussion. People are going back and understanding that, hang on, but resistance is mentioned and enshrined in international law. So surely, I mean, the Palestinians have that right in as much as, that they are occupied. So people are, in a way, because of the kind of downward spiral in terms of standards and professionalism of the mainstream media, people are becoming more aware. I mean, not less aware, in a way. There is now a segment of society that understands that things aren't as portrayed on their screens.
Yeah.
And that surely is something which is entirely positive.
Yeah, there's definitely the contradictions are being heightened by the hypocrisy of the press and by the omissions of the corporate media, because you're right, it does heighten this process whereby people seek, especially younger people, but not exclusively, seek for alternative sources of information, and that means they end up then supporting independent news organizations and smaller websites, outside the ambit of mainstream news in the West, and seek for Palestinian news sources, independent news organizations like ours, the Electronic Intifada. We've started this live stream on YouTube since the 7th of October. It's had quite a big audience, and so we've kind of been the beneficiary in a way of the of the corporate media's lack of willingness to do actual real journalism, because then people come and search for real sources of journalism. And yeah, I mean, so there is that positive side of it, and it's the absence of the truth and the reality of the Palestinian narrative within those corporate media organizations is just so stark, and it is kind of opening a lot of people's eyes, where they're seeing the hypocrisy and they're seeing the double standards and they're seeing the real agenda at play in these news organizations. I mean, it's only last year and the year before, 2022, 2023, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2022 and 2023, the mainstream media, so-called, was full of open praise for armed, for arming people in Ukraine, for Ukrainians fighting Russian, for Ukrainians fighting Russian soldiers, fighting the Russian invasion. And even to the extent where there was even praise for Ukrainian fascist groups, like the Azov Battalion. And that was just openly out there. And there was, I forget who it was, but there was one journalist who was involved, it was reposted to his Twitter of about how to make a Molotov cocktail, to fight Russians. And so we're seeing, so it's okay to support Ukrainian Nazis because we're so anti-Russian. And yet for Palestinians to defend themselves with arms is viewed as quote unquote terrorism. So, this is so stark. There's such an obscene double standard that people are really opening their eyes to it, and people are saying, well, hang on, this can't possibly be fair or just.
I'm reminded that it's sometimes quite uplifting, I have to say, when you find young people, and I focus on young people because they're the next generation of decision makers, they're the next generation of leaders, they're the future governors of our affairs. So for them at the age of, let's say, 16, 18, 20, 22, to start asking those questions and to demand answers is something which is promising. It means that we're not amid an increasing expansion of Zionist propaganda that is going to cover our airwaves. In fact, there is going to be a challenge to that, and there's going to be a demand for answers from those who are going to be the leaders of the next phase. So for me, at least, I think that what's happening is extremely uplifting. But at the same time, we have to mention the fact that the Israeli lobby, and now more and more people are coming to be aware of this Israeli lobby here in the UK as well as in the United States. And it wasn't just because of the brilliant series that Al Jazeera produced on the lobby here in the UK as well as in America, But because of the war in Gaza, people all of a sudden started understanding the politicians aren't really saying it like it is.
Yeah.
The media isn't really asking the real questions that need to be asked, because there must be some sort of pressure. And all of a sudden they're going back to this lobby that is there. But this lobby is, I mean, one of the means that it uses is intimidation.
Yeah.
And pro-Palestinian activists, pro-Palestinian commentators are being attacked, are being marginalized, are being tarred, are sometimes often being intimidated. We've seen that. And this seems to be part of the overall picture to fight this war away from the epicenter of the war, which is in Gaza, but also to expand this war to, to over here in London and in Washington and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Israeli planners, Israeli think tanks, Israeli ministries, and what they've been saying and planning and talking about within their media for years is, they view it as a global battleground, as an ideological battleground. They call the Palestine Solidarity Movement, their term for it is the delegitimization network, where there was one very famous series of policy papers and presentations by a think tank, an Israeli think tank close to the Israeli government, a successive Israeli government, called the Reut Institute. And they, in one of their PowerPoint presentations, they talked quite openly, and they made a comparison between Israel and apartheid South Africa quite openly, and saying, apartheid South Africa, yes, there was... the ANC fought against it, the ANC campaigned against it internally, and they even took up arms against it. But the apartheid South Africa was never defeated on the battleground militarily in a conventional sense of armies against armies. It was never defeated that way. But it was defeated through a collapse of its legitimacy. Yeah. And so we have to try and making a comparison between Israel and apartheid South Africa.
So it's incredible, don't you?
Internally, they're doing that. But, publicly, if you made that comparison, they would call that anti-Semitic, of course. But the point was that, and it's true that they were saying, that kind of legitimacy can be lost very quickly. Yeah. And so therefore we have to have this global battleground. And they do talk about it quite openly in those ways. They talk about peaceful campaigning, political lobbying, if you will, for the Palestinian cause, even, lawyers and legal campaigns for the Palestinians, and just protesting on the street. They talk about that as a battleground.
Yeah.
They talk about it as... and there was one article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz quite a few years ago now, where it was reporting from within the Israeli embassy in London, and according to this Israeli reporter, they had up a map, a sort of a battleground map of the battlefield, and the battlefield to them was universities in the UK. That was one part of it, was universities, is the battlefield. And so, they will employ, and they have been employing all kinds of dirty tricks they can possibly mobilize against Palestinians and their supporters in the West. And a large part of it, I mean, as you alluded to, without explicitly saying earlier, a large part of it is Islamophobia, that Muslims, especially prominent Muslims in public life, maybe people who are commentators, activists, journalists, solicitors, campaigners like yourself, people who would maybe seek to go on to these news platforms like Piers Morgan, like Talk TV, not because they agree with those journalists and their political persuasions, but because they want to seek their audience. They want to seek the larger audiences they might have access to, then get kind of trapped and get ambushed on these programs. Yeah. And quite often it's done in, it can be done in a fairly Islamophobic way, where as a Muslim, you are then or as somebody who has spoken in favor of the Palestinians, it is then demanded of you to condemn Palestinian resistance factions as if, you're responsible for armed struggle by Palestinians as a Muslim. So that is, there's a large element of Islamophobia to it as well. And that is something that Israel definitely takes advantage of and tries to really encourage in the West, really, as because it suits them and it suits their narrative.
Yeah. 2024 is going to be an exciting year. We have elections over here in the UK. We have the American presidential elections. How big do you anticipate Gaza, particularly, to figure in the way that people vote? I mean, obviously, people have their own worries. They have their own concerns. We've been having a cost of living crisis here in the UK. In America, the plethora of crises that confronts, most Americans every single day is gigantic. And surely there are those local issues. But then again, I find more and more, let's say in America specifically, talking about how many billions of dollars are sent to Israel, whilst, for instance, there are so many homeless people in America every single day. How, for instance, someone who did not comment at all on the situation in Gaza, but said, Israel is far richer than we are. Israel has no public debt that is akin to anything that we have. Israel has free healthcare when we don't. And yet we continue to send billions of dollars in cash as well as in aid every single year to Israel. And that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So in a way, whilst that might not pertain to what's happening in Gaza directly, but it's an offshoot of this.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
What kind of impact do you foresee happening in our elections and in the American elections
I think
this year?
it will definitely have a big impact on both. It may not be the decisive factor, but I think both Democratic Party and Labour Party strategists would be foolish to ignore it, and they can't ignore it because it's becoming a growing problem for both. What we're facing on both sides of the Atlantic is an interesting point of view, is an interesting situation, because in both countries, the US and Britain, there is a sense in which both both parties, the Democrats, both allegedly sort of center leftish parties, the Democrats and the Labour Party, they're both in a political position now where both of them are, the difference between them and their conservative opposition party of government in this country, obviously, is on policies is actually very little. The difference between the two is very little, especially the policies of Joe Biden are not very substantially different from Donald Trump in a lot of areas, in most areas. And the Labour Party's policies since Keir Starmer came in as Labour Party leader are, almost identical, really, to the root.
And he said he's not going to change much.
Famously, Joe Biden said that nothing, in his election campaign to become president, he said nothing will fundamentally change. And the Labour Party, ever since Keir Starmer came in, has been rolling back all of the Corbyn era policies one by one. And he's a very sort of shifty individual who has really betrayed the party membership that have voted for him, because he's gone back on all his pledges. Notably, the only pledge that he's kept is that he was a supporter of Zionism without qualification.
Yeah.
And he's definitely, that's the words he used, and he's definitely done that. He's gone out of his way to support Israel. But I think that it's the issue of the genocide in Gaza that the Israelis are carrying out is a problem for whether they like it or not, and clearly they don't like it. It's a problem for the Democrats and it's a problem for Labour, because their voter base, the people who they rely on to mobilize for them in elections and who they rely on to vote for them, it's going to be harder and harder for them to come out en masse to vote for those two parties when they are so adamantly against the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And Joe Biden especially, but also Keir Starmer, are very, incredibly outspoken in favor of what is happening. Keir Starmer even said that, on national radio, infamously a few months ago, that Israel does have that right to essentially starve Palestinians, to cut off food and water to Palestinians because of some imagined right to self-defense. This is obscene. The latest obscenity from the Labour Party, and I was just reading today, was that David Lammy said that, well, we're not going to vote for the SNP's resolution for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza because this is an election year. We wouldn't want to jeopardize our election. I mean, our election prospects. What he's saying makes no sense because, it would be a popular electoral policy. I mean, what he's really talking about, it wouldn't jeopardize his electoral chances. What it could jeopardize is his funding, because the funding from the electoral funding for the Labour Party's electoral campaign is coming from, in large part, from pro-Israel lobbyists, people like Trevor Chin, people like Gary Lubner, who are backing the Labour Party now with millions and millions of pounds potentially in supporting for their electoral campaigns. But, this money is not, it's not a fixed thing that they definitely need, because during the Corbyn years, they didn't have this kind of corporate money, And yet, when Jeremy Corbyn left the Labour Party, when he quit as Labour Party leader, the Labour Party was in the best financial shape that it had been for a long time. Yeah. And why was that? Despite the corporate money, they had the backing of the membership. They had the backing of the people, essentially. That's where the money was coming from. That's no longer there. And so, I suppose the silver lining is that the Labour Party and the Democrats are being constantly challenged on this. And I think where we're seeing some independent candidates being put up to oppose the Labour Party narrowly on the issue of Gaza locally in certain areas. People like Liane Mohammed opposing Wes Streeting, George Galloway opposing the Labour candidate in Rochdale in the by-election. We could potentially see some upsets.
I mean, very, very briefly, but this is something that we really need to talk about, and that is the ICJ. You see, what I don't understand is this. Now, okay, fine. People take and assume whatever ideological or whatever position that might be driven either by financial interest, funding, political, whatever. But what I don't understand is this. Do not people understand the veracity of the ICJ's ruling? The fact that it is plausible that Israel has committed, the fact that they have accepted the case filed by South Africa against Israel in the case of genocide. Do people not, of the intelligence you'd assume of Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Joe Biden, do they not understand that if this ruling came to be affirmed in the final verdict, that they would be seen, or they could plausibly be seen, as aiders and abettors of a war crime?
Yeah.
And that they would go down in the echelons in the books of history as supporters of a war crime.
Yeah.
Surely, what's happening? Are people not paying attention, or what is it?
Yeah, I think they are smart enough to understand that logically, but I think they are just essentially relying on being backed and supported by power, essentially. Look at Tony Blair. We all know that Tony Blair is popularly understood by so many people to be a war criminal. That he was a key factor in the devastating invasion of Iraq, which killed more than 1 million people and led to so much devastation, for a whole generation in Iraq, and really destroyed it in a lot of ways destroyed the country. Thankfully, it's getting back on its feet more now, but it's still living with the legacy of that invasion. And people understand that Tony Blair was really a key factor in that, and is understood by so many people to be a war criminal. And yet he's protected. He's never faced any consequences for that, and he has, this very cushy career doing all kinds of nefarious things, lucrative speaking engagements and so forth. And so, although they're kind of undermining their own popularity within their party membership, they're relying on the backing of the British government, which, without a fundamental change in this country, they will probably get, unfortunately. But I think that the ICJ ruling that Israel is plausibly carrying out a genocide in the Gaza Strip is something that can. It's definitely an important precedent, and it's definitely an important ruling. And we can see that people like Keir Starmer, David Lammy, and Lisa Nandy are absolutely on the wrong side of history, and I think they're going to have to face that blow to their reputations.
Thank you, Asa. Fantastic.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.